That's all right. Good to see you. If you say so.
I want to say with regard to that we are working with Arlensburg, with Abe's firm, to try to take on systemically some of these problems that we've talked about. It's a great privilege for me to introduce so many of you who probably don't know Bruce Jacob to Bruce Jacob. Bruce joined the office of the Attorney General in Florida in 1960, right out of law school. And 2 years later, he was assigned to argue Gala University Wainwright in the Supreme Court of the United States. What an opportunity for a person who just got out of law school and wanted. And that's a great thing about going to Attorney General's offices, is often that happens. He was assigned the task, of course, as we've talked about, of arguing before one of the greatest lawyers, certainly at that time, maybe the greatest appellate lawyer in the country, Abe Forrest. It must have been quite an experience, Bruce. I expect that it was exhilarating, but also a little terrorizing at the same time to be there. But once Gideon was decided, I want to tell you the rest of the story, because once Gideon was decided, Bruce Jacobs became a champion of the right to counsel for his whole life, right up until he walked in the door tonight. A mentor and an inspiration to so many lawyers who represented poor people accused of crimes is incomparable. The number of people that have been helped and the number of lives that have been touched. At Emory Law School in Atlanta, he set up the Legal Assistance Project for inmates at the Atlanta Penitentiary. The Supreme Court called him back to argue another case, the case of Kaufman versus United States, which he argued and which held in 1969 that a claim of unconstitutional search and seizures could be raised in habeas corpus. Not good one anymore, but it was good while it came then. He went to Harvard for a SJD degree and set up the Prisoner Legal Assistance Program, and still there to this day. So many of my students have participated in it. He supervised students representing poor people in both civil and criminal matters. And then he went to Ohio State University and was the director of clinical programs there. My friend Dennis Balsky, who was a great defender of poor people accused of crimes, told me that Bruce taught him, inspired him, and gave him critical advice during one of the first death penalty cases he tried. Bruce was later the dean at Mercer Law School and then at Stetson Law School. He's the dean emeritus at Stetson today. As I said before, it's impossible to know how many lives he touched and how many people were represented by his students, but we do know this. Bruce took on the post-conviction representation of a man who had been convicted of murder because the man's mother, the cleaning lady at the law school, told Bruce that she did not have the money to hire a lawyer. This is the very best kind of professor, the kind who teaches by example. Tonight we recognize Bruce Jacob for a lifetime of teaching, inspiring, and mentoring to make Gideon a reality. Bruce. There you go. Oh, there you go.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for those generous remarks. Thank you very, very much. It's a tremendous honor and a privilege to receive this award in the company of such remarkable individuals as Vice President Mondale, Abe Crash, and Anthony Lewis. This award means a great deal to me and to my family. 3 members of my family are here, and I'd like to introduce them. They're sitting at this table. My daughter Leanne Gunn, son Brian, and wife Ann. During my teaching career, for many years, I taught clinical courses, supervising students in the representation of indigent defendants in criminal cases, as Stephen pointed out. We would lose a motion to dismiss or a motion to suppress, even though there was a United States Supreme Court decision that seemed to be squarely in point on our side. We would try to get that ruling overturned, and I found myself telling students more than once that just because the Supreme Court has decided a case doesn't mean that that decision is going to be immediately followed and accepted by the lower courts. I tell my students that sometimes it takes 50 years before a Supreme Court decision catches on and is accepted and followed and fully implemented by the lower courts throughout the country. Some courts are just not aware of the decision. Other judges know about it, but they don't like the decision and just don't follow it. I know state judges who take the position that they do not have to follow U.S. Supreme Court decisions. Finally, 50 years or so after the Supreme Court has made a decision, lawyers, courts, and legislators throughout the United States get used to the decision and they begin to follow it and begin to implement it. Well, it's been 50 years since Gideon, and it's about time for that decision to catch on and to be fully implemented. It is not yet being fully or completely followed or implemented by our legislators or by our courts. When a public defender has such a heavy caseload that he or she can only spend 5 or 10 minutes conferring with an indigent client before allowing that client to plead guilty, the requirements of Gideon are not being met. Or when a public defender is handling so many cases that the defender, that defender can only spend an hour or an hour and a half preparing for a felony trial, even though a paid lawyer would spend 20 hours or more, the promise of Gideon is not being met. Gideon and the cases following Gideon require not merely that an indigent defendant should receive the assistance of counsel for his defense. The defendant is entitled to the effective assistance of counsel. And effective assistance cannot be provided by a public defender who has a caseload of 500, 600, or 700 felony cases per year. We certainly are better off now than we were before the Gideon case was decided, but we have a long way to go before the holding of Gideon really catches on and is fully implemented by legislatures and by the courts. And that's where the Constitution Project comes in. Jimmy Sloan and all of those associated with the Constitution Project are doing everything they can to make the promise of Gideon a reality. On another subject, it's very sad that Anthony Lewis could not be here with us this evening. I met Tony Lewis on January 15, 1963, in the Supreme Court building on the day that the Gideon case was being argued. He sat inside the bar, far to the left as we faced the bench, and I believe he was using a small portable typewriter. During a break, probably the lunch break in the case, he came up to me and he introduced himself. He said that he was the Supreme Court reporter for the New York Times. He also told me he was not a lawyer, but he said the court allowed him to sit inside the bar, even though the bar inside the bar was usually reserved for members of the bar. After the argument, several weeks later, he phoned me. He said he had decided to write a book about the case and he wanted to interview me. My wife, Ann, and I met Tony at a hotel near the old Tampa airport. I was able to provide him with copies of letters and documents which we got from our file in the case. I understand that he was a consultant to those who made the film Gideon's Trumpet. For the most part, the movie was pretty accurate. However, the scene when I'm arguing, of course I'm arguing on the wrong side of the case, the courtroom is packed. In reality, though, there were only 2 persons in the courtroom other than the lawyers and the judges. One was Anthony Lewis, and the other was my wife, Ann. She was the only person in the entire spectator section of the court. It seems strange that for a case of that significance, there was only 1 person in the spectator section, but that was the way it was that afternoon. Also, the actor who was chosen to play my part in the movie has a southern accent. And I was born and grew up in Chicago. Did you know that Tony played a small role in the movie? After the second trial, Gideon was standing at the door of the courthouse, and lawyers and friends crowded around him, and they asked, what can we do for you? What can we do for you? Is there anything we can get for you? And Gideon said, I sure would like a McDonald's hamburger. And Tony was the one in the film who hands him the money to buy a hamburger. After Gideon's Trumpet, Tony and I corresponded from time to time. Also, we had mutual friends who would relay messages back and forth between us. We participated in the panel discussion held at American University on the 30th anniversary of the Gideon decision. When I wrote a law review article about the Gideon case about 10 or 12 years ago, he read the draft of my article, and his response was helpful to me and was very much appreciated by me. 10 or 15 years ago, I invited him to be a speaker and panelist at a Stetson Law School conference held in Clearwater, Florida. He graciously accepted our invitation. His wife, Margaret Marshall, was with him, and the two of them, and Ann and I and our daughter Leanne, had dinner together. Leanne was a graduate student in journalism at the time, and of course she was thrilled to be able to have dinner with one of the great journalists and great writers and authors of our time. Also, I should add that being able to have dinner with Margaret Marshall, as well as Tony Lewis, made that dinner even more special. Tony Lewis was not only a great writer, he was a very good person, a very good human being. I sincerely wish that he could be here with us this evening. Again, I want to thank Ginny Sloan, all the members of the Constitution Project, and Stephen for this magnificent award. Thank you all very, very much.